Hi guys, and welcome back to the Female Disruptors Summit, virtual summit, excuse me. I am very, very excited to be introducing our next guest, Stella. Stella is a star, and that is a complete understatement. She is a PR professional, and one of the things I think I respect so much about you, Stella, is you're really one of the pioneers of the intersection of SEO and PR, which is very interesting. I know you'll dive into all the beautiful details. But Stella here is the co-founder of CoverageBook. It's a reporting tool for communications professionals, and I myself use it. I know a lot of publicists in the industry that value CoverageBook for its ability to measure PR, which is a very kind of touchy subject. It's difficult for a lot of us publicists in the industry, especially when we're competing against departments like marketing specific or advertising specific. So Stella is going to walk us through the metric that will give PR a competitive edge in 2022. Stella, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jess. Nice to see you again. So, oops, I've just gone a little bit too far. So yes, I am Stella. Here we are. And as Jess said, I work at CoverageBook, which is a PR reporting tool. But previous to working in PR tech, I've actually just reached my 20 years in public relations, 20 years. So I started off in what you'd call traditional PR agencies in London. I'm actually joining you from my studio in London right now. So hello. used to live in New York for a little while. So can't wait to get back and join some of you guys who are in the US. But yeah, so I started off in traditional PR, and there was a moment where I was going to present back all of my results, which I was really proud of, for a big drinks brand actually. And we went into an all agency meeting, which if you guys work in marketing, you'll know the kind of scenario. So we were joined by the advertising agency and the digital content agency, and we're all there because we'd all worked on the same campaign. And there was a moment in that meeting where we all shared our results. And even though I'd gone into that meeting super proud of all of the work that we had done, I left feeling deflated and not as proud, just because of the metrics, the lack of metrics we had in comparison to the other areas. So that is what my talk is all about today. So we got onto that. But it was at that moment in that meeting room that I decided to go and join a digital marketing agency and learn as much as I could about metrics and about measuring the success of communications. That was about 12 years ago. And then I did, as Jess said, started to go into search engine optimization. I went in-house at brands and integrated all of the different digital marketing and PR areas and measured those. So I'm going to bring all of that experience hopefully into this talk. Well, some of it anyway, not a whole 20 years. We've only got 20 minutes. So we'll see how we go. If you want to follow me, I'm at Stella Bayles on Twitter and also at CoverageBook. But I also have a podcast, which is the PR Resolution podcast on all of the normal platforms. And if you, we also have a blog as well and a book, but I'll tell you about that stuff at the end. So let's get started. So before I sort of go right into the metrics, I just wanted to take a step back and say, why do we even need metrics? So why do we need to measure PR? Well, we need to measure because we need to know what has been successful for us in our own planning and what to do more of or less of in the following year. But also, apart from our own work, so whether we are in an agency or whether we are in-house, marketing has a budget as a whole, and that normally needs to be split to different activities in different areas. So whoever is in charge of that budget allocation has to make decisions around that. So we've just gone in, we're in January right now, so we probably all know what budget we have on some different areas of marketing. But a few weeks ago, somebody was in their space thinking about how this year might pan out and what to do more or less of marketing and how to allocate that budget. And it tends to sort of fall into, there's many, many different areas, and there's many blurred lines now, as we know, if you work in marketing, but it tends to come into these areas. So paid, or either advertising, and then owned, all of your owned content, whether it's your own website, could be social channels, and then earned is influence stuff and public relations, can also be SEO in there as well. Obviously, public relations, which is the area that I'm talking about today, falls into earned. So we're talking about how the budget gets decided and where it goes. So really today, we want to be thinking ahead now. So when when the marketing director, chief of marketing, is making their decisions about the budget, it's going to be around November, December time. So what we want to do is get ourselves in order right now. So we've got our KPIs and our metrics in the best shape possible for this year ahead, and track as well as we can, so we get that better budget for next year and get ourselves into a powerful position. So this is not a big surprise. As I say, if you have ever been involved in other areas of marketing, you would have heard of marketing attribution. And that is, if you're not aware of it, is how marketing as a whole is successful, and how success is attributed to all of the different areas. Now, I have spoken to many experts in attribution. I've done 3 podcasts on it now, been involved in papers, and public relations is really, really hard to track. Because it's so difficult, it's often just left out of the equation. So what you'll find in marketing attribution, especially for big organizations, and especially when there is e-commerce and it's to consumers, attribution tends to be mainly about how sales and leads coming through websites, and how that comes through from paid advertising, and then SEO is sometimes considered in there too. PR is often left out. And let's just have a look at why that might be. It's probably not a big surprise if you work in public relations and you are generating reports, and you think about some of the detail that goes into advertising reports and some of the metrics that they have, and then we think about our metrics. It's not a big surprise of why that sometimes gets left out, because we don't have, well, first of all, we don't have access to all of the metrics that these other areas do, because we earn our coverage, we persuade publications and editors to write about our organization, about our clients. We don't have access to their analytics, so we can't see all of the metrics that if you were paying to be on a website, or paying to run an ad on Google or on social platforms, you have access because you're paying for that, right? And in the same case, if you are looking at how successful your own content is on your website or your own social content, you have access to all of the analytics. So yeah, of course, they have access to many more metrics than we do. So yeah, let's move along to earned. What do we have there? So we have reach. We look at how influential some of the platforms they're getting coverage on are, because that's what we have access to. And then PR measurement has developed in the last few years. We are starting to just about look at whether there has been any, if there's links in our coverage, and then when there's clicks through to a website, we can now look in to see whether there might have been a sale off the back of somebody reading our coverage, or there might have been a lead or a download, or whatever your KPI may be with your organization. So it has moved on. We are starting to do that. That's brilliant. I've got AVE with a question mark there. Now, AVE is, I'm not going to spend too long in this presentation talking about AVE, but if you may well be aware of it, it's a metric that is a very historical metric in public relations. And it's because as I've just said, it's really hard to get to values in public relations. So AVE was brought in many, many moons ago, before really we were talking about digital PR. And this was a metric when we were more focused on print So when we were getting articles and features in print magazines and newspapers, AVE is the advertising value equivalent. So it used to be looking at literally how much it would cost for a placement. So sometimes that is still used, but there's like quite a big sort of stand against using that metric in PR. So it was trying to sort of see less of that. So again, without that, there's often a bit of a grey area in how we can start to compare and compete with these other areas and their metrics. So what are these other metrics? So I said that in that previous slide, they look at impressions, and there's often cost of impressions. So that's actually like looking at how many people see that content. So how many views it's had, and then the cost of placing that. But then off the back of that, then often marketing will then look at new leads, qualified leads, sales. And if it's not a sort of consumer-led organization, it will look at downloads or sign-ups, if it's more of a B2B client that you might be looking at. Now, all of these, there's so many metrics now that we're literally swimming in a sea of data these days. But I do know that from our so I do know that from my background, when I was working at a digital marketing agency, the reports were so different to PR. So previously in my PR agency days, we would have our report that was very visual. It would be a screen grab or a scan of our coverage, and it would look great. We'd be able to see the brand mention. We might be able to see an image that we'd managed to persuade the journalist to include, and then we would see the nice big header of a publication that we would recognize, our clients would recognize. Then you'd have a big number of the readership of that publication, and that was really sort of where the numbers ended. So as I mentioned right at the beginning, when I was in that all agency meeting and then sort of sat beside other teams and other agencies that had so many metrics and so many numbers that were backing up that proof of business progression, business success off the back of their work, you can see why well, I don't think I shared with you, we actually we smashed all of our KPIs, but our budget reduced in that meeting. So that's why today I just want to share what we're up against these days. In PR, we're not just up against other PR agencies, we're up against these other different styles of agencies and different metrics. So we're hopefully going to get back into the competition. So yeah, that's sort of what we're against, and that's what the budget holders' decisions are being based on. That's what they're looking at. So let's return back to PR. So as I mentioned, often this is the kind of metrics and the kind of reporting that PR does, and there is reason for that. So we have our PR coverage, so it goes live, and then we look at the publisher details. So that could be its monthly traffic, or if it's a social influencer, a social platform that we've managed to build a relationship with and they're talking about our brand, we might look at their followers, or we might look at the show viewers or the podcast listeners. But it's often, and I've put like the total subscribers there. So all of those metrics are really useful for us mainly to be able to say, yeah, it's really influential. But what does it say about the coverage? So I just want to plant that into your minds now. What are those big total numbers saying about our work, that one piece of coverage? So just bear that in mind. In PR reports, we sort of go from saying, yep, here's our coverage and here's the total impression, here's the total monthly traffic for that site. And then if we've had a campaign, we then add all of those up, and then we have this reach figure. So again, if you are working in PR in an agency or in-house, this won't be new to you. You will be very familiar with reach or readership, it can be called, and that is the total of all of those monthly traffic figures or total influencer followers, and we have this one big number which has been historically used in PR reports. So reach can be misleading, So again, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the budget holder, because this is where if we can do that, we can really be putting ourselves in a powerful position to start to help them a bit. So let's think about our PR reports and why reach can be misleading. So thinking about an article on a publication, for example, when we report on the total monthly traffic for that particular website, let's think about our particular piece of coverage. Did we get a brand mention on every single page of that site? Because if you're thinking about, if we're saying about a publication and it has 1.5 million visits that in a month, did those 1.5 million people see our brand mention or our piece of coverage? Well, probably not, you're thinking, no, but you might have achieved homepage coverage, and that is absolutely amazing if you do. It's incredible if you get homepage coverage, especially on a news site. But homepage coverage, really, I mean, if you have ever achieved that, well done if you did. But as you all know, it doesn't stay there very long. News is being updated more frequently than ever, and it will probably become more and more frequent as time goes on. But it's often there for, if we're lucky, one day. So it definitely, so that number, that total 1.5 million site visits for a publisher, that's spread over 30 days generally, depending on what month. Did our piece of coverage remain in the main part of the site for 30 days? Also, when we think about a site, that 1.5 million is going to all different pages. It's not just all coming in through the homepage. So if you really start to be realistic about the 1.5 million, how many of them did actually see our piece of coverage? So when we are thinking about where our PR report is going, and the good news is PR reports are being forwarded around organizations more than ever. Like, it used to be really pigeonholed and it would just go to a PR director, but people do know the value, even though we can't prove the value often. People do generally know the value of PR now. So they are being forwarded to all sorts of different departments and different stakeholders. So that's great. But then they're used to seeing these more accurate numbers. So if you think they see these huge reach numbers, it doesn't fill them with so much trust. And can they use it? So reach is often a KPI and a metric that we track in public relations. It has been for many years. It's on every single PR report that I ever see. But what does it do? How can it help our stakeholders? A KPI should be something that they can actually use, not just for us to show off with. Can stakeholders use reach? I've got a quote here from somebody called James Alexander. So James, I used to actually work with James in my first PR job at an agency called Hill & Knowlton, which is a global agency, so you might have heard of it. And he went on through his career to work at Diageo, which is, I think, the world's biggest drinks business. They own Guinness and Smirnoff and many other drinks brands that we all have probably known and tried. And James is like head of influencer and PR marketing, but he specializes in trying to evaluate all of the work. So it's not just PR. He is in charge of the budget of all marketing in Europe for the drinks brand. So what he does is look at he has a real interest in PR because he started off in PR, but he does have to, at the end of the year, so in December, so just a few weeks ago, he would have been analyzing all of the campaigns on all of those different drinks brands in all of Europe, and then looking at which ones were successful, which ones he should put more or less budget to. And that goes for internal teams and for all of the agencies as well. So there's quite a few there. So he needs a methodology to that. He needs some way of comparing, evaluating, and then passing the budget through. Now, he really knows deep down that PR is making a big difference, but that's because he started in PR and he believes in PR. But he has his own stakeholders, his own internal managers that he has to go and answer to for this budget and to work this out. So he needs some numbers to back that up. So we're thinking about the budget decision time. So this is roughly what James and other people are doing, but we can use James as an example. So as I mentioned with James, there's multiple brands that he works for, looking at, and there's multiple campaigns within those brands. But just to simplify for today, let's just group it in paid, owned, and earned. So the way that James looks at this, and the common metric for paid and owned, is impressions. So yes, you do see proof of sales, you do see many other metrics around traffic and time on site, but generally the common metric that goes throughout paid advertising, no matter where that advertising is, and also through any owned content, and also through social content, again, whether that's advertising or whether it's owned, impressions is the common metric that they will see. So already there is multiple areas of marketing that can be joined together, and a consistent metric that brings all of that activity, no matter how different it is, in common, apart from PR. And apart from earned, because rather than looking at the impressions of some content, we look at the total impressions for the publisher that we managed to get coverage on in one day in one small area. Now, if you're working in PR, you may be sitting there thinking, well, yeah, that's great for them because they have access to that. We don't have access to that. So what's the next best thing we can do? Okay, so that's what I'm going to come on to. So there's the views on content in that middle area. And then somebody like James has to work out, okay, so the views gives us a good idea of how many people saw it, how many, if we're thinking about brand awareness for all of these different areas of marketing, because yeah, there are other areas of evaluation once you get through to leads and to sales, but taking a step back, just how many people saw this content, this marketing content, impressions, reach. Then we've got the cost for the views on that brand mentioned. So in paid and owned, cost per impression, again, is a common metric throughout all of those different areas. And once again, in paid and owned and social, there is that common consistency in the metrics. So somebody like James can easily look at quick view, okay, that piece of activity had that many views and it cost this, and I can work out my cost per impression. Then we have PR, and then we have the costs, and then we have some guest views, but we don't really, it's about the publishers, it's not about the content itself. So as I mentioned already, I've got all areas of PAYSO. So for anybody who doesn't know what PAYSO stands for, it's paid, earned, shared, and owned. Shout out to Jenny Dietrich, that's over at SpinSucks. She actually created the PAYSO model. So I do recommend having a look at that, but it's just a sort of an abbreviated way of talking about all of those different areas of marketing. As I mentioned, all of them can prove leads and sales, even PR. But if we only looked at that, it's actually almost puts us in not a very great position, because if you have ever looked at sales off the back of PR coverage, it's never going to be as much as paid and owned, because paid advertising, especially if it is consumer or create, it's often created with a sell and a lead in mind, and it's paying to be there. So it's very, it's got that, that's the sole objective for it. So it always has high sales and high leads off the back of it. Earned has many different objectives. Often it's about brand awareness, change in opinion. We could sit here forever talking about all of the other benefits of PR, but often sales isn't the top priority. If it was, you might actually choose to do paid. Yes, there are sales off the back of PR, but often it's long term. Think about you being a consumer. If you read an article online, New York Times, you might see a product be mentioned. It's very unlikely that you'll click through and buy that immediately. Often what we'll do is read that article, it'll be logged somewhere, and then we might go and Google it later. There's a little bit of SEO there, which you can see why I went into SEO, but that's not what I'm talking about right now. But as you can see, if you look at direct sales off the back of PR, it's going to always look smaller. Okay, so we've got, all right, we can still prove sales, but how can we get into this comparison game? So I'm going to explain why estimating the views of your coverage can get you into the competition and into that comparison game. So what is estimated views? Well, as I mentioned, and if any of you work in PR and report on PR, then you'll know, as I've already said, we can't have access to all of our publisher analytics, unfortunately. One day it might have, no, it probably won't. They won't give us access. It'll expose them too much. So we can't get the true impressions as advertising can, or from our owned content. What we can do is estimate it. So I talked about the total audience or the total traffic that goes to a publisher. And what we can do is, by looking at other factors on the page and other factors in the coverage, we can estimate how many people would have actually seen that. Now you can see a big CoverageBook logo there. That's because we have put a lot at CoverageBook. We have put a lot of time and effort into a formula that estimates how many people would have seen a piece of coverage. So we have tested this. Our customers have tested this because they want to be able to trust it and to be able to confidently speak to their stakeholders using this metric. And it is, I'm pleased to say, it's spot on every time. We actually had, maybe I can't mention the brand, but a very well-known American golf brand. Their head of marketing has some really good relationships with other big sports and golf publishers, because he runs advertising, and because he has those good relationships, he tested some of our estimated views on the coverage reports that he had, and he was like, can you just have a look at your analytics and tell me how close it is to this number? And they're like, yeah, spot on. Where did you get this? So yeah, we have put a lot of time and effort. So what we do is we look at the URL of the piece of coverage. And then from that URL, we can see whether it was on the home page or deeper into the website. So that's the first sort of gauge for us. We then look at the total traffic based on last month of that particular publisher. And then we look at the social shares of that of the page of your piece of coverage, and then we also look at a metric called domain authority. Domain authority is available to anybody. It's a metric that's used very often in the SEO world, search engine optimization world. If you're interested in looking into DA or domain authority more, I recommend going to a site called Moz. And you can like download a toolbar.
I'll link it for you. Stella, I just want to give you a quick heads up. We got to wrap up in like a minute.
Oh, okay.
I know you're just diving into estimated coverage, but I just wanted to give you a little heads up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so check out the metric in CoverageBook. But if you're not a CoverageBook user, don't worry. You can just try and estimate it yourself. Well, I'll share all of this afterwards because it might be a bit quick to quickly run through it. But basically, awesome. Just getting more realistic and not using that big reach number and big traffic number, because that's what James does at Diageo. So the full part of this quote is, yes, reach doesn't give him a lot, but estimated views and then using that as a proxy for impressions really does help him. So this is what you can start to get: impressions, and then estimated views as a proxy for impressions. Now, getting to the important bit of the value and getting into that competition is understanding how these other areas come up with their cost per 1,000 impressions. So this is the common metric that they use, and it really is like cost per 1,000 impressions is CPM, is a very common metric used in other areas of marketing. So the way it does is like how much it costs to place an ad to get 1,000 views of that. That's what's used in advertising and on owned. So what can we do with PR? We can do the same thing, but with estimated views. So step one is get into estimated views and don't use your total publisher traffic. And then step two is to work out the cost per estimated views, and then to pass and share that with your stakeholders. You can track this all year. So what you want to do is calculate to make the estimated views, work out the total costs of your PR. So not just the costs of a campaign, but also retainers and salaries, like total costs, because that's what happens in the other areas. And then you do this calculation. So this is what we'll share because it's going to be really quick to have to run through. So the total cost to generate a coverage, and then the total estimated views. So this is an example. So the 1.5 million, say, you might have had on a site. And then you want to get that into 1,000 chunks. So you divides that the total into each 1,000 chunks, and then you divide that by the cost, so it gets your cost per impression. So this is what you want to be doing at the end of this year. So you can make a note of it now and then do these workings out at the end of the year, because once you're then in the comparison game with the other areas, you can start to really prove the value and then bring in all of the other great reports and ways of showing off PR too. But final thing is update your PR KPIs. So you've got this in there, get involved in the competition with other areas of marketing, track and measure all of this year, and then make your budgets and put yourself into a powerful position for next year. That's it. You can get all of the work on this year.
Thank you, Stella. I know that it's so much information to fit into a short time, but your expertise is so valuable. We will share your presentation with everybody after this closes. And thank you guys for joining this conversation. And we will see you at the next panel.
Thank you.
Bye, Stella.
Bye.